Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you could join us today for this webinar, All Hands on Deck. I'm June Rawl. Today we're joined by Tara McLarnon from the Florida Department of Education and Jenna Moniz from Atlantic Technical College in Broward County. Tara and Jenna will share some recent data trends in adult education and discuss some of the important considerations around student retention. Think about, why do we lose our students? In today's webinar, we're going to delve into some of the demographics and start to discuss some possible solutions. But you know that will mean all hands on deck to make a real impact. So again, I'm so glad you could join us today and be a part of this discussion. But before we get started, I want you to know that your attending microphones are muted. I hope you do interact with us today. To do that, go to the Q&A section on your screen and type in your question or comment. We will be reviewing these questions and comments periodically throughout the webinar. As in the past, today's webinar is being recorded. Look for it in the archives on the IPDAY website. The recorded webinar and all the PowerPoint materials will be available for you within 48 hours. The PowerPoint today is already preloaded on the IPDAY website, so you should already have that in hand. At this point, I'm going to turn the conversation over to Jenna, and we're going to get started. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're so glad to have you with us today. I'm very excited to be joined by our DOE colleague, Tara McLarnon. And just to give you a brief heads up on what we're talking about today, as June shared, we're going to share some AGE data, recent data with regard to where our students are enrollment-wise and what's going on with retention. We're also going to talk about the Florida Department of Education targeted assistance, so some of the continued support from the DOE. We're going to talk about some strategies on how we can continue to encourage students to persist through their goals. And of course, we're going to talk about wraparound supports that help the whole student. So without further ado, I will let Tara jump in. We're going to talk a little bit about what the data says, what the data trends are showing with regard to student enrollment.
Excellent. Thank you, Jenna. All right, if you want to go ahead and go to the first slide, I'm excited to share some 17-18 NRS data. As always, I have a lot of data, so condensing down what I was going to share with you guys was a challenge, but I thought I would start with looking at some 4-year trends in the ABE levels, looking at ABE levels 1 through 4. I was excluding out the ABE levels 5 and 6, which is the adult secondary programs. And I wanted to kind of show you trend-wise where the performance has been going, as well as where we've seen enrollment trends. And if you can sort of get an idea, what I did was I put 4 years worth of data, and then I showed the change from the first year in the trend and the last year in the trend. So historically, in almost all areas, our performance has dropped, most drastically in level 2. We've had a 13% overall decline of level 2 students making at least one learning gain or a diploma. We have seen improvement of our highest level ABE students in making a learning gain with a 3% gain over the 4-year time period, but there was 2 years of a drop. So the data definitely has been very curious. I think some of that had to do with the implementation of the new GED and just taking time to transition students to earning that GED. But the enrollment is where we've seen the most drastic change. As I'm probably not telling you anything that you don't know, but enrollment overall is down, and particularly our lowest level ABE students is where we've lost the most ground in getting those in. Either we're doing a fantastic job and they're coming in higher than before, or it's just a population that is not seeking out adult education like they have in the past. Jen, if you can jump to the ESL one, thank you. So this is the ESL version of that chart. And so there are a couple of things I wanted to point out on here that I thought were very interesting. And that is the growth that we've seen in our lowest level ESL students, our level ones historically, going from a 38% performance rate to a 46.87% performance rate. I wish we had that same kind of trend in all of our other areas. Perhaps most concerning to me is our level 6 students, the number of students who have been making a learning gain when they started out at level 6, and these would be the students who would be transitioning actually out of ESL, so they would be testing out. Our performance has dropped by 44% from 4 years ago. So definitely something that is a little bit concerning at the state level, and something we'll probably doing a little bit more of a dive into. I would love to definitely hear from some of you guys on why you thought that might be the trend, or if you're seeing something similar to it locally. When we look at the enrollment, this is the part that was most interesting to me on the ESL. There's definitely been a shift of students. We are taking in or transitioning in less of the upper level ESL students, but having explosive growth of our lower level ESL students. So those that are level 2 and 3, if you look, there's been almost 100% increase in the level 2 students that we serve from those we served in 14-15. And so we're serving in ESL lower level students, those that have a harder time or have more ground to gain before that they have transitioned out of ESL. And so definitely something we're going to be taking more of a look at. Some of the things that Jenna is going to spend time going over is what are we doing once we get these students in to retain them. If we're actually serving more students at the lower levels, it's going to take them a little bit longer to get through and transition out of adult ed. And so employing every strategy we have to keep them engaged and involved is more critical, because they have that much farther to go before they're college and career ready. Jenna, do you want to jump to the next slide? So just some trends when I looked at 16-17 to 17-18 NRS data at the state level. Overall, we were about a 10% decline in participants, which we were expecting to see. We've heard from you guys locally, as the economy improves, you guys lose students to employment, and that's a great thing, but finding a balance and helping to encourage them to both be employed and stay enrolled in class is definitely something that is going to be a challenge, but I think one that we probably need to begin to address some strategies for how we can encourage that. What is interesting is this has caused a shift in the demographics of the age grouping of students that we're serving. So because we've lost so many students who are in the 19 to 24 range, we've lost about 14% from year to year. We've actually seen an increase in the number of 60+ students. So it's not necessarily that we're serving more students who are 60+, it's just that they're making up a larger proportion of the overall population. This obviously is going to have some impact on some of the employment outcomes, because a large portion of these people are not actually interested in employment. They're retired. They're just looking to improve their English or improve their educational skills. Race, ethnicity, oh, sorry, Jen. Race, ethnicity, I thought what was most interesting is 42% of the overall 10% decline that we saw in participants was Hispanic males. And so I thought that was a very interesting demographic that had such a significant impact. There were declines in other areas. As you can see, Hispanic participants, including male and female, was an overall 14%. Black participants, 7% decline. White participants was a 2% decline. But that Hispanic males was something very noticeable when we looked at some of the different breakouts of the information. All right, Jenna, I'm ready. Thank you. All right, so to where we're really at, and this is something we are focused on, we are looking at, is our post-test rates, and wanting to see overall how many students are post-tested. Now, this is looking at the comparison of the students in the NRS tables. This is not looking on a course-by-course basis. That is a different data set that we could potentially look at, but for us, we're looking at your Table 4B versus your Table 4. And overall, only 41% of adult basic ed students got post-tested. And only 52% of ESL students got post-tested. Now this is actually, I went back to 16-17 to look to see what our percentages were there. And in 16-17, we had 46% of our ABE students got post-tested. So we had even fewer students in this year who they were able to hit our denominator, which means they got that minimum 10 hours, but they did not stick around long enough to get post-tested. And that's troubling because you can't even get a gain unless you've been post-tested. For ESL, 52%, that's actually a slight increase. In 16-17, we had 50% of our population that were post-tested. So that is an upward trend. That is great news. I do want to show on the table why we're so interested in the post-test rate. When we look at the overall performance of everybody, including those students who were not post-tested, our measurable skill gain rate for ABE was 21%, and for ESL was 28%. That's far from what our expected state targets are. But when we look at those students who were post-tested and whether or not they made a gain, 49% of our adult basic ed students who were post-tested made a learning gain. So the great news is if we can get them to stick around long enough, we far exceed what our performance expectations are from the federal government in terms of our state targets, and have a much greater percentage. So we know that the gap and what's really killing our performance are those students who are sticking around just long enough to be a participant, but we're losing them somewhere between 10 hours and whatever you've set as your benchmark for post-testing students. So I think this is something definitely that Jenna's going to talk a little bit about in a few minutes about what's going on, and in terms of how to motivate students, what are some of the root analysis of why students are leaving. And then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing at the state level to focus on this issue, because we are definitely moving forward with some initiatives to address our post-test rate. And so hopefully between the two of those, we will help to answer those questions, but a lot of it is going to be locally driven because you guys know your students, you know what their needs are, and you know hopefully what is effective in helping to keep them enrolled so that we can get to that post-test rate. Go ahead, Jenna.
No, I was just going to say it's a really good point, and you know, you bring up some really important and interesting data with regard to students and retention, but you're absolutely right that this is not a one-size-fits-all solution. There certainly is not just one solution, and it's not going to be a matter of us doing just one thing. So this is the reason that we wanted to come together really as a conversation, not us sharing out to you or us telling you what to do or you know, a one-way conversation. This really truly is going to take a collaboration across this large state of Florida. So it's great that we have the support of the DOE, and that you know, even though the DOE is such a small group of folks, they're certainly mighty and always responsive and listening to the needs of the field. So I'm certainly appreciative of you all listening and wanting to know what we think is going on, and not only wanting to know what we think is going on, but what we think we can do to make a difference and how you all can support. So we certainly will be talking more about the efforts at the level of the DOE. But this is interesting data, and interesting data trends, Tara, that you share. and a lot to wrap our minds around. So we want to give you a minute too. We know that we've got a large group of folks that are attending. Some of you are attending in groups together. So we encourage you all, as we're going through these slides, to converse, to have conversations, mini conversations among yourselves. This may be kind of like a professional development opportunity. This may be one of the only, times, because you're so busy, that you have to collaborate with your colleagues. So, we really want to encourage you to take advantage of this time as active conversation, not just listen and get, but also start the conversation at your local sites about what we can do to strategize and move this needle together. There are a couple of questions in the chat, and we'll just put this out there that we know that there may be questions coming in, and if we don't get to all of the questions, we certainly will follow up afterwards. You've got Tara's contact information, you have my contact information, you have June's contact information. So if we're not able to get to every single question, we will absolutely make sure that we get back to you afterwards. And Tara, I know that you showed data with regard to ABE and ESL. There's a question in the chat asking if these trends carry on into the GED levels. So I'm not sure if we know what the GED level data is telling us, or if we assume that these are similar trends as well.
So for this particular presentation, because we were so focused on looking at post-test rate and retention, I limited it to just the ESL ABE. I have not yet done the analysis on the, particularly because I will do ED.
No problem.
Better reports soon that I start to divide into that.
Yeah, and we know that the GED data is a little bit trickier too. So what we're talking about here with regard to the data and the completion and post-testing data that gets sent forward to the federal Department of Education and our NRS data, we are looking at students that are post-tested on tape, so more specifically at the ABE levels.
Yes, and then I think there was another question about whether or not we are looking at other states and how they compare to Florida figures. Right. So I haven't done data on 17-18 because it's not available for other states yet, but I have looked at prior year information to look to see how we do, and I've sort of limited my scope to states that serve similar populations to us, such as Texas and California, taking into mind that they may count different things for completion than we count. For example, in California, the types of OCPs that, or the LCPs that they count are a little bit different, and they're only funded on learning gains. So it's a little bit of a different system. But our performance is usually in the bottom quartile when compared to all the other states. That's historically where we have fallen, is into the bottom quartile of performance.
Right.
For post-test rate, I haven't seen that information for other states. But again, because the data comes in very differently, sometimes they have high post-test rates because they're only reporting the students that were post-tested. They're not including all the students.
Right.
So.
And so with regard to peeling off the layers, underneath the data, and why we're trending on losing so many students, the question obviously on us to answer and ponder is why. We've talked a little bit, I know I facilitated a webinar where we kind of talked about why we think what we think the reasons are that we lose students, and as Tara mentioned, we get students who have come to us, they're ready to make the sacrifice, they have a goal in mind, or somewhat of a goal in mind to pursue and further their academic careers for a reason. They get to us, they happen to stay with us long enough to be counted as a participant in our data, but not long enough to actually post-test. So what is happening in that time between coming to enroll, paying their tuition, getting into classes, and the time that we have to post-test them? So if you haven't in your schools, and I encourage you now just to spend maybe 30 seconds talking to one another about what you think some of these trends may mean. Interesting way to look at it, and maybe I'll pose the question out to the group. Are there any institutions, are there any agencies out there that are seeing the opposite trend? So, you know, if we open up the chat now to answering the question, why do you think that we're losing so many students? I know we'll get a lot of responses. So I encourage you all to speak, you know, among yourselves right now. But are there, just out of curiosity, are there any institutions, any agencies out there that are seeing the opposite trend? Are you seeing growth with regard to your enrollment? And if not, and if your trends are similar to the ones that we're seeing across the state, when we talk about getting down to root cause analyses and why we're having this problem and how we, you know, before we can even start to take steps to respond to the problem and come up with viable solutions. It's important for us because when we start to answer the question why, there are going to be plenty of examples that are out of our control. Student situations, their lives, their hardship, what they're living through, work, you know, there are lots of reasons that make it very difficult for students to get to us in the first place. So I do just want to encourage us, as we're having these conversations, to pivot back to the things that are under our control and the things that we can do. Are there things that are under our control as educators, as agency leaders, as teachers, to make the difference? And again, this is not a one-size-fits-all answer. You all know your populations best. You know your students best. You know, I happen to be in South Florida, so Fort Lauderdale area. That's going to be, you know, very different from Osceola and Pinellas, and so your responses, your answers, your solutions may not look like our solutions, but in this collaboration, we could probably come up with some trends that might be, you know, effective across the lines, the geographic lines. So when we start to talk about data, and we peel off the numbers and we're looking at the numbers, we're, you know, obviously talking about people, and we start to have these conversations and look at our students, what is going on with the people underneath the numbers, what's going on with our students. And we know that our students come from all walks of life. It is probably safe to say that, you know, in being an adult ed, we are likely not the first choice for many students, although that trend may be changing a little bit, you know, with regard to GED students. Our students are getting younger and younger, and some students are catching on that, hey, this is another route to earn my high school diploma that, you know, may just be faster than the standard high school diploma. But our students are, you know, tend to come from situations that they've been through something and have survived through that and have persevered, you know, enough to get to our door and enroll with at least intentions of bettering their academic careers and their lives. But we know that their lives can be very complex. And for any of you that were fortunate enough to attend the ACE conference a couple of months ago, you had the pleasure of attending our keynote speaker's speech, Mr. Jonathan Edison, who is the author of a number of books, including Survival Mode. And Jonathan, Mr. Edison, talked to us about his life and his journey and his own personal trek from real unspeakable hardship to the place that he is now, very successful motivational speaker and author and father. But his days were very difficult as a child. I mean, really, truly unspeakable situations that he had to persevere and push through. There were a couple of moments where there were very few dry eyes in the audience, if any of you were also there. But Mr. Edison talks to the importance of being able to push and persevere through survival mode, living in a place of survival mode. He also alluded to an educator, a teacher that he had when he was very young in elementary school, who found, who was able to see the light in him, who found what most of his other teachers told him was more of a behavioral issue, this teacher happened to look at and say, you know what, you've got a gift. You've got a gift of being a powerful communicator. You know, that translated in his other classes into, you know, talking too much or being disruptive. But this one teacher saw a light in him and said, you know, son, you're a strong communicator. This can take you very far. Well, again, you know, Mr. Edison persevered through homelessness and you know, living through really tough hardships to where he is today. And he still meets with that teacher. He sees this teacher on a monthly basis. He and his family have dinner together regularly. So it's important because, you know, what he spoke about being in survival mode is not just a cool label. It's not just a cool title of a book. It's very real. And there is, you know, growing research being done just on the study of, you know, brain research and what happens to learners and what happens to people who are enduring long-term, short and long-term stress and the effects on the brain. So we talk about the learning brain and being in a place of being ready to learn versus being in a place of constant stress and what that actually does to the makeup of the physical, biological makeup of the brain. And we know that with continued stress, you know, lots of things happen biologically in the brain. The prefrontal cortex of the brain, and this is the place in the brain that we use to make decisions, to think critically, to work together, to communicate. Right? Sound familiar? This is everything that we do in education. We know that with long-term stress, there are all kinds of chemicals that are given off in your brain, including cortisol, that really literally shut down the functioning of your brain. It wreaks havoc on the brain. It does everything from killing off new neurons being, you know, developed. It can even shorten the lifespan of your brain cells. It decreases the size of your brain. It really just wreaks havoc on the brain. It makes it impossible to be in a place ready for learning. So it's important enough to give us pause because, you know, we throw around the terminology, you know, I'm under a lot of stress, I'm pressured, I'm stressed out, but it may really truly behoove us to slow down and think about actually what happens in the brain. And if our students' brains are not in a place ready to learn, then what are we doing in class? If they're sitting in class and they're in survival mode and we're focusing only on academics, we may not be hitting the mark. In fact, Oprah Winfrey recently on the CBS Morning Show shared a piece that she had done on 60 Minutes with regard to some groundbreaking research being done in the Midwest with regard to sustained trauma. And she spoke to, and many of you may know that Oprah started a school in South Africa. And this research affected her so profoundly that she went back to her board in her school in South Africa and said, we've got to stop what we are doing and start from scratch. We are doing this the wrong way, folks. And her message was, if our students are impacted by stress on a daily basis, if they are affected by stress, which leads to anxiety or can lead to anxiety, if we don't address that first and foremost, then we can't begin to talk about academics. We can't begin to talk about career goals. We can't begin to talk about all of the stuff that we're used to talking about until we work first with the person's emotional, mental health first. You know, and in her very Oprah way, you know, says, we've got to heal the hole in the soul first before we can talk about anything else. She went on to say that her philanthropic, as many of you know, Oprah is the giver of all givers, that anything that she does with regard to her philanthropic efforts from now on will only include efforts that deal with the emotional and mental health of people first. So powerful words from Oprah. So, we think about just our daily lives, our troubles, work, fear. And if you look at just kind of some of these labels on the slide, I don't know that there are any labels here that every single one of us deals with, at least at some point in our lives. We all deal with life, stressors. So it's not just important to think about the well-being, the emotional and mental well-being of our students, but also of ourselves. If we are living with, a number of stressors, and you'd be a very rare person to say that you're not, it's important that we check in and look at, what we're dealing with first. If we are to lead a classroom of students or lead a group of educators, we've got to really be able to take a look at where we are and be self-aware and check in and see how we're doing with regard to our own health. And also important to be aware of the frame that we see the world through, because, the way that we see our students, the way that we see our staff has everything to do with our own experiences. So it's important to be self-aware. And we're going to talk a little bit more later on about mindset and being self-aware. But this also ties into and plays into the importance of just knowing who we are and how we show up daily to work. It's pretty difficult to avoid stress these days. If you read the news, and how can we not? We have to know what's going on in the world. But just by watching the news, they every day they're, whether it be natural disasters or political chaos or mass violence, it's almost expected that when you turn on the news, you're going to see something that is a stress inducer. Regularly, if you're at a school location that, whether or not it's attached to a K-12 institution or not, it's becoming our norm to go through regular code red drills and active shooter drills. These are just becoming a part of our natural, normal, quote unquote, normal vernacular and daily practices. And we have to understand that this is causing us to be in a place of thinking about, fearful situations. So you think about your brain being in survival mode, that means your brain is in fight or flight mode. Once your brain is in fight or flight mode, all of those things that we were talking about start to kick in, that cortisol starts flowing in. You're not in your optimal place to be a creative and be at to be your best self, to be in your best place. And then with sustained exposure, we're talking about it, quite potentially turning into, mental health issues, including anxiety, which we know a lot of our students deal with. And, we know anxiety and depression and, mental health doesn't discriminate. We all probably know someone who is dealing with, some level of mental health, concern, from as small as, stress to as, important and substantial as big as depression. And it's not about money. Clearly we know that. So it's hard to avoid for one. And it's for sure we all know someone who is dealing with sustained levels of stress. And driving that back to the students who are in our classes, it is pretty safe to say that a good number of them are dealing with, have dealt with, levels of whether it be circumstantial or sustained stress. I have an amazing teacher on my team who, and for those of you who were able to attend the ACE conference, she presented on her journey, her own personal journey to becoming really, I'm going to go ahead and call her a master of problem-based learning. And she talked about how she grew through the process and how it changed her, and how she had to grow into a different kind of educator. But she also says that she would never go back. Part of what this did is, make her turn the focus onto the students first and foremost. And our students come to us. We spend the most time as teachers. Our students spend the most time with us. So it's such an opportunity with the time that we have with them to make some really, really transformational, have a really transformational impact on our students, not just with regard to the academics, although obviously the academics are key. But we're going to talk a little bit about how we can affect both, the mental, emotional stability of students and health and persistence of students as we address the academics. So this teacher recently, and this was through, listening to students and polling students and asking students, what is it that's important to you? What is it that's on your mind? What is it that you face day to day? She happens to be a science teacher. The students, this conversation got back around to, mental health issues, depression, anxiety, test anxiety specifically. So the class went into a study on the science of depression. And again, she's a science teacher. They focused on the science aspect of it for the most part. But very quickly, she was able to pull in, you take a look at those high impact indicators, she's able to pull in the standards from across the subjects. So as they did this research, into the biology, the chemistry of depression and what happens in the body. And they're talking really, post-secondary, college-level material here, from neurotransmitters to epinephrine, serotonin, dope. All of the language that they're using in the room is very much post-secondary, research that they're doing. But she was able to weave in standards from across the curricula, which is, exactly the idea. And the beauty of problem-based learning is it can be very much interdisciplinary. So, in this specific lesson, they were able to target at least 3 of the science standards, at least 3 of the RLA standards, certainly the math standards. There were charts and graphs that were involved that we know cut across the subjects. And social studies is sometimes the outlier, but even, by focusing on cause and effect, they were able to hit some of the standards, or at least one of the standards in social studies as well. And these students went through a process of researching what happens to the body through depression. They then turned that into a reteaching. So, through different presentations, they had choices. Some of them made brochures, others did PowerPoint presentations, others made music. They had choices with how they were going to reteach and retell, all learning the same standards, but in their own way, in ways that spoke to them. And they decided they were going to take that a step further because they were so moved through these lessons that, they found this problem. They did the research on this problem of mental health and depression specifically. What can they do about it on small scale? What can they do about it in their community to affect some level of change? And they decided they were going to, pull together an empathy group. So they created literature around it. They purchased bracelets that they then wear, and they use these bracelets as an indicator that, hey, I'm a safe space. I'm a person that you can come to talk to. I'm a person here to support you. What's really interesting about this class, too, is that so many of these students are ready to pass the GED test in science, but don't want to leave the class just yet. Even after they've passed the class or the science test, they've come back as volunteers to continue on studying with them. And we love that because, well, first and foremost, we know that earning a 145 on the GED test is not enough. We know that to be ready for post-secondary level, at least a 165, college ready is what's necessary. So we encourage them to stick around and to volunteer if they had already passed the test, but they wanted to stay. They wanted to be in the class because they were moved and they felt like they had been pulled into the lesson, that what they felt and what they were contributing mattered, that the teacher wove their personal experience into the lesson. It was very, very powerful. And this teacher has done, problem-based learning on other topics in the past. They've tackled global warming, they've tackled renewable energy, and these are all choices that she's given the students, and obviously they tie in the standards, but these are issues that matter to the students. And what we're finding is that our students are sticking around when they've made social connections, when they've made connections to other people, when they feel like they're in a community, when they feel like they have someone to talk to. We see groups of students saying, I'm not going to go and take the test until you do. We're going to make sure that we all push through together. So we caught on that this is, something really important that we've got to respond to. It's not just the academics for many students that bring them to us and keep them here. It's the connection, the sense of connection, and feeling like you're a part of a team, feeling like you're a part of a group. I mean, if you think of just humanity, traditionally, we are clan people. We grow up together. Traditionally, families lived, multi-generation together. So the idea of not having a support group, not having someone there for you. And think about our students. Many of our students don't have a support system. So by building in these support systems, we're finding that our students are wanting to stick around a little bit longer, and that's good news for everyone. And of course, coming from Broward, we actually, in this class, as they started to share about their own personal experiences with mental health issues and anxiety and depression, we had a student who shared that he, in fact, was a student at Stoneman Douglas and knew Nicholas Cruz in a freshman year. And, obviously, Nicholas Cruz dealt with mental health issues, is dealing with mental health issues. But what we took out of this was this student who's here with us now knew Nicholas Cruz, and he shares about the fact that, or the idea that he wanted to reach out to Nicholas Cruz because everyone else said, don't talk to that. You don't want anything to do with that kid. He's not well. And he didn't reach out to him. And, this is something that he's very open about sharing now. And that, in hindsight, obviously, he wishes that he had reached out to him. So we know that isolation can lead to very, very, in this case, really scary, really, really scary and tragic scenes. So we know that we've got to focus a little bit more on the sense of community and making students feel like they belong. And of course, there's, Sandyhook that is not far in our memory. Sharing this to share that Sandyhook has a curricula that they've developed called the Sandyhook Promise. Maybe many of you have heard about it. And it's not just geared toward elementary. It's called It Starts with Hello, and it is exactly to address isolation and making sure that students feel like they are a part of a community. So I encourage you all to take a look at that Sandyhook Promise. It Start with Hello curriculum. It is free, and they encourage you, to use even portions of it, just the concept of it, in your own institutions. So we can, help students persevere, help students move on, help students to achieve the goals that they came to us to achieve in the first place. Oftentimes the students who are difficult, that we consider difficult to deal with are the students, if you think back on Mr. Edison, some of what presents as behavior issues, just a mask for, other stuff going on underneath, ways to cope with the stress that they're enduring, that they're living through underneath. So how can we start to get to what's underneath that stuff before we start teaching? If they just walk in the door and we say, welcome in, pull out your TABE prep materials, pull out the prescription, and we're not making room for the student, we're missing a huge opportunity and possibly losing students because of it. And then they won't reach their goals of earning a high school diploma if that's the goal, or mastering or getting close to mastering English so that they can have a stronger career, so that they can have a better lifestyle. We want to make sure that we're inviting the whole person into learning, as opposed to teaching to the test, right? There is a clip here, or a link here, I'm sorry, that I would invite you to watch. I won't get into it too much today, but this is a study that's actually done on implicit bias. So when we talk about, and you had mentioned a little bit earlier, knowing how we show up as educators, knowing, being self-aware and knowing not only what we're dealing with and what we're going through, but knowing and being aware of the lens through, the lens that we see the world through. It's absolutely normal for all of us to have our own biases, and our, it's the way that we were raised and what we saw and what we knew growing up is going to taint or paint the way that we see the world. So as educators impacting so many people in front of us, it's important at least to be aware of, some of what we bring into the classroom, everything from being, healthy and stressed out to, maybe some of the biases that are maybe known to us or implicit, maybe some of the hidden ones. Anyhow, this study points to a correlation between implicit biases, so, hidden, unknown biases that we may have with regard to some of our students and teaching to the test. I encourage you to take a look at that video. The link is here. We want to make sure that we're not just teaching students to pass a CASAS test, pass a GED test, pass the TAPE test, but to be successful in the world and be successful at the post-secondary level and in their careers. And the research also shows, we've spoken about this before, that teacher efficacy, again, Mr. Edison, knowing that someone believes in you, knowing that a group of people believe in you and have high expectations for you does really, truly make a difference and can be super impactful. It made the difference for our keynote speaker, that's for sure. And we talked a little bit about what this will take on behalf of not just the teachers, our students as well. It's important that we know that we have so much power. Students have so much power. Teachers have so much power to make an impact, to make an impact on our direction. So if we're looking at where we are now with regard to retention and keeping students, it's going to be important that we're open to some shifts, open to looking at who we truly are, having honest conversations, being transparent, and having conversations about what our classes look like, what students experience. It's going to take a level of exposure, and that can be uncomfortable. So if you haven't heard of Carol Dweck's study on growth mindset, highly encourage you to do so. Tara McLarnon shared this with our group, and she may allude to it a little bit more. But again, we encourage you to look into, the idea of having a growth mindset for us as educators and for our students, because to some degree it will take some shifts in the way that we do things. So, with keeping our time in mind, I'm just going to let you peek at this slide a little bit if you haven't already, and I encourage you to take some time to do some research on growth mindset, because if we're talking about making a change in a lot of senses, it will mean that we've got to be open and honest to looking at what we're doing and making some shifts. And when we start to listen to students, when you look at, this is a quick chart of a study that was done on why students leave high schools, traditional high school, and it's important to look at some of their responses. Number one, I was failing too many classes. Yeah, but that's a loaded response. There's stuff underneath. That's when you start to peel off the layers. Well, why? But look at number two, I was bored. It's important that we take a look at that. What does that mean that you were bored? So again, the idea here is that we're looking at our students, listening to our students, surveying our students. In fact, there was a county not too long ago that did a wide-scale survey with their students on why they're not staying. This county thought that students were going to say, things like transportation and childcare, etc. But what the responses actually spoke to, and this is an AGE district in Florida, what their responses actually led to were that students didn't find the connection. They didn't see instruction being meaningful. They didn't see the connection between instruction and their careers. So powerful that we actually listen to our students. I encourage you all to survey your students locally. And obviously our curriculum are our standards. It's going to mean teaching to the standards, obviously, always, not to a book, not to a test. And the ESOL group has new standards, right? And the nice thing is that now we're all talking the same language. ESOL through GED, they're all aligned to the CCR, the College and Career Readiness Standards, which allows for a lot of overlap, which is beautiful, and really, truly preparing students for post-secondary level and careers. And the 21st century skills that they're going to need at the career level and the post-secondary level. The 4 C's, which are critical thinking, collaboration, communication, and creativity. If you're teaching to a test, we're not teaching the 21st century skills that are needed at the college level. And then just briefly, recently I found this study, and this just was released a few days ago actually, from the Association for Psychological Science. And this study, the link is at the bottom of the slide. I encourage you all really truly to take a look at this research. But what it speaks to is the fact that folks who are going into the workforce now are not equipped with the collaborative problem-solving skills that they need to get the job done. Sound familiar? So the data is coming back from all directions. The employers are telling us that their new employees don't have the skills to work together, to collaborate and solve problems together. That's a message to us. And of course, ability to benefit is back. Again, ability to benefit is back, meaning that we can enroll students on the college side, the CTE side, the post-secondary side at the same time as they are pursuing their GED goals, their high school diploma, as well as ESOL goals. There's criteria there, so if you have questions about that criteria, feel free to reach out to the DOE. But we want to make sure that students are getting into the workforce. The workforce is screaming for employees, that we're getting students into the career and technical fields, into the post-secondary level, while they are working toward their diplomas and learning English. And there's a way that we can do this. At the AGE level, so when we talk about getting students into post-secondary and, at the same time that they're enrolled in GED and ESOL classes, obviously we're talking about IET, or integrated education training. And this is everything that we're talking about. Get them together, collaborating, working together, even at the AGE level, practicing some of these skills that they're going to need at post-secondary. What we've just started is a contract with students, a student pledge as they come in the door. We're happy to share this with you, but the idea here is just, and this is not what ours looks like, but this is just an example. The idea is having the students make a pledge when they walk in the door saying, this is my goal. I know life is tough. I know I may have challenges. These are some of the strategies that I'm going to put in place to overcome those challenges. And key here, if I ever start to consider leaving school, I promise to speak to 3 people first, 3 educators first. And then we're going to be getting their social media contact too, so we can track them down. Sometimes those telephone numbers change quickly. We know that this is important, not just on the AGE side, but retention is an issue post-secondary as well, and especially with regard to making sure that we are getting, for accreditation purposes and otherwise, getting students, or former, students into the careers of their choices. We're going to need to track them and follow where they've actually gone. So this is something else that we're trying to put in place. And again, you might want to have a plan in place for attendance, tracking attendance. When you start to see students' attendance fall off, what things are you putting in place to make sure that before they even start to fall off? If you see a trend of a student missing 3 or 4 days, do you proactively do something about that? Do you have a team in place? Are there triggers in place? Are your teachers making calls? Are we following up on those calls before they even withdraw? Here we know that, we don't have a lot of the staff that we're all understaffed, and, to many degree. We've armed our teachers with those tools. Our teachers have become coaches. Our students are most comfortable talking to our teachers anyway. So we sit with every single student, our teachers do. We have a process where each teacher sits with every single student at least twice a term and talks about their goals and clarifies the steps between TABE testing and GED testing and what their next steps are, just to make sure that the steps are clear to the student and clear to the teacher, and that we're transitioning them on to their next steps, making sure that they've got everything in place to successfully move on. So that process also includes talking about what's going on in their lives. What are some of the challenges that they're facing? And if those challenges are something that we can help them out with, then obviously we can. And if not, then we will actively look for agencies or supports, community services that can help them. So this is a process that we go through. Each teacher sits with every student, and that at the end of the term, we have a team of folks that then sits with the teachers and talks about every single student. So we really, truly are trying to make sure that we're not letting any students slip. And then, of course, the idea of celebrating student success. We know you all have great ideas out there and great ways of celebrating student success. Everything from certificates to stars and badges and pins and shouting students out and putting graduation caps and gowns on and having individual celebrations for students. Celebrating success is highly important. We know that for a lot of our students, it's the first time that they've been validated and celebrated at school, as opposed to, hearing the opposite message. So lots of ways that we can get active. We know that you all have lots of ideas out there too. Again, we don't want to, make it sound like we've got the answers. We're trying things. If something doesn't work, we'll try something new. And we really want to be able to collaborate with you all out there, because it really truly is going to take all of us, all hands on deck, talking about how we can move the needle forward. So Tara, I've got the slide up here. It was a great opportunity to be able to sit with you and the DOE and the team at the DOE a few weeks ago and talk about some of the things that we can do across the state to help address retention and post-testing rates.
Yeah, and I think these have been shared a couple of times at different forums, but I did want to share them with everybody here and talk about what at the state level we're doing, just to sort of encourage you that we're not just saying you have to do initiatives locally, that we are also taking ownership of this issue and what we can as a state do outside of what we've been doing historically, because historically we've been doing a lot of things and the performance rates have continued to decline. So this was sort of a chance to do outside the box thinking. We pulled together some of our local providers. Jenna was one of them. It was great. It was 2 intense days that I had the honor of facilitating. And what we came up with, Jenna, do you want to go to the next one?
Sure. Oops. There we go.
So we came together back in September and used the growth mindset as sort of a practice of it. And we just we wanted to throw everything out there and then start to filter it. So if you want to go to the next one, you can kind of see that's just sort of an example. We went through a lot of Post-it notes. And where we ended up is the next slide. So we have 3 initiatives. Really, there's 4, but the first one is a combination. And this is what we at the department are going to be doing. We are actually going to be conducting research on instructional best practices that correlate with increased retention that lead to increased post-test rates. So we understand that retention is driving post-test rates. And so we're going to actually do some research on what helps keep students instructionally in that classroom. We're also going to be doing some research on enrollment and attendance policies and the impact on post-test rates, and using those in the future to develop TA on best practices. We're going to create an advisory group to develop a toolkit of orientation activities and processes, sort of a place where you can pull things and information from. And I know we're short on time. So, and the last initiative that we're going to be doing is developing a series of user guides, sort of 1-page, 2-page briefs that are on post-testing and assessment information that you can actually use as part of your communication plan and give to students, give to teachers, so that it makes it really clear on what the expectations are for assessment and what assessment really is used for and what it means. So with that, we're going to kind of wrap up. Jenny, you want to go to the last slide? I don't know that we have any time for Q&A. I did see some questions, and we'll be sure we address those with the individuals that sent those questions in. But I do believe we needed to get to the next feedback slide, right, June?
Right, and there was just one question in the chat that I did want to address. There was a question about how many students we actually serve at our agency, because it's important to know with regard to sitting with every student individually. Our daytime program has somewhere between 300 and 400 students, so it's a large number of students, and we conquer and divide. So this is, a group. So the way that we set it up is each teacher is responsible for a set of students. And, and we've got other staff that are, hands-on as well. Our security officers are always involved. Our counselors are involved. Even, our clerical staff get involved to some degree. We're getting creative about the way that we use people to, to really reach out to make sure that we don't let anyone slip. Now, there are a number of questions in the chat that we won't be able to get to just here, but we promise we will follow up with each of you individually. And again, you've got our contact information, our email addresses, and our telephone numbers. So feel free to reach out to either one of us. And then, June, I'll turn it over to you for some feedback if you're there.
Wow, thank you so much, Tara and Jenna. You did an amazing job, and we really appreciate that. Well, before we end today, there's some feedback questions that are going to appear on your screen. So if you could just take a moment to answer those questions, we would appreciate that. And while you're doing that, I just want to remind you that Our next webinar will be on January 9th, Key Ideas and Details Critical to Reading Comprehension. This is the area of reading comprehension that's a major domain that's assessed on the TABE 11 and 12. So you won't want to miss this webinar on that. We're going to give you a lot of strategies and resources and lesson plans that you can immediately implement into your program. So the poll is going to now close, and I just want to thank all of you for your time and your response, and we look forward to hearing from you. And again, Jenna, Tara, thank you so much for such an informative webinar. We appreciate it.
Thanks all. Take care and happy holidays to everyone.
Yep, happy holidays to everyone. Enjoy your break. We'll still be working at the state.